You're just trying to get home after a long day, when a train conductor tells you to move to the back, simply because of the way you look. You feel humiliated. But what happens next? In the next few minutes, karma steps in and takes control. What happens when the universe steps in to right the wrongs? Stay tuned to find out. Before we start the story, comment below and let me know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. The train was packed as usual, with people heading home after a long day at work. Among the crowd was a woman in a business suit, looking exhausted from her hectic day. She stepped onto the train, scanning for an empty seat. The noise of the busy commuters filled the air, but she didn't mind. She just wanted to sit, relax, and get home. She finally spotted an empty spot in the first-class section right by the window. It wasn't a mistake. She had paid for the ticket, and the seat was hers. She made her way over and sat down, letting out a sigh of relief as she settled in. The gentle hum of the train and the soft buzz of the crowd around her seemed to calm her nerves. But just as she closed her eyes for a brief moment of peace, she heard the voice of the train conductor, sharp and commanding. He was standing at the front of the car, staring directly at her. Without any warning, he pointed at her and said, "You need to move. That seat is reserved. I need you to go to the back." Confused, she looked around, wondering if he was talking to someone else. But his gaze remained fixed on her. She raised an eyebrow, trying to understand what was happening. "What do you mean?" "I paid for this seat," she said, her voice calm but firm. The conductor, without an ounce of hesitation, replied, "I don't care. Move to the back of the train now." His tone was dismissive, cold, and authoritative. He didn't even look at the ticket. He just made it clear that she wasn't welcome where she was. The woman, stunned and slightly embarrassed, glanced around, hoping someone would step in. But everyone else was too afraid or too busy to notice. She was on her own. She could feel her heart race, her face flushing with a mix of anger and humiliation. But she didn't want to cause a scene. She grabbed her bag and slowly walked towards the back of the train. As she made her way down the aisle, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some of them uneasy, others indifferent. When she finally reached the back and sat down, she couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. Why had this happened to her? What made the conductor think he could treat her this way? She looked out the window, trying to calm herself. But the nagging feeling of unfairness wouldn't go away. She had been singled out. It didn't make sense. She had just wanted a quiet ride home, but now she was sitting in the back, humiliated, while the conductor went about his day as if nothing was wrong. The situation felt wrong, but for some reason, no one was willing to speak up. The tension in the air was thick, and she could tell that everyone else in the car knew something wasn't right, but no one dared to say anything. As the woman sat in the back, trying to compose herself, the weight of what had just happened started to sink in. She could still hear the conductor's voice echoing in her mind, the way he had dismissed her without a second thought. It wasn't just about the seat. It was the way he treated her, as if she didn't belong there, as if she was beneath him. The anger started to build up inside her, but she kept quiet, not wanting to stir up more trouble. She looked around the train, watching people whispering to each other, their eyes glancing nervously at her. No one spoke up. No one said a word. They just kept to themselves, acting like nothing had happened. But she knew. She knew that if she said something, if she stood up for herself, the situation would escalate. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. The train continued to rattle along the tracks, the hum of the engine a constant background noise. But for the woman, it felt like the longest ride of her life. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her mind racing with thoughts of what she could have done differently, how she could have fought back. But the frustration and confusion left her speechless. For a moment she just sat there, staring out the window, trying to push the feelings of humiliation aside. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The woman tried to focus on the passing scenery, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the conductor's harsh command. What had given him the right to treat her like that? Was it her appearance? Was it her race? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, but something that made her feel small, invisible, and powerless. The more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. It wasn't just a simple mistake or misunderstanding. It was something deliberate. Just then, the train screeched to a halt, snapping her out of her thoughts. The sudden stop jerked her forward in her seat. Passengers shifted in their seats, muttering under their breath, clearly startled by the sudden jolt. The woman's heart skipped a beat. Was this some kind of emergency? Was something wrong with the train? The doors opened and a few people stood up, preparing to exit. But something felt off. The usual routine of people getting off and on wasn't happening. Instead, there was a strange tension in the air. People were whispering, their voices low, but there was a sense of nervousness. She looked around, trying to see what was going on, but everyone was keeping their heads down, acting as if they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. The doors remained open for longer than usual, and the woman could hear the distant sounds of voices approaching the train from outside. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the car, but no one seemed to have any idea what was happening. The passengers shifted nervously in their seats, some looking at their phones, others staring out the windows, pretending everything was normal. But she felt the unease in the air. Something wasn't right. She sat there for a few more moments, unsure of what was going to happen next. Then, out of nowhere, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the train. The woman turned her head, her heart racing. A group of 3 uniformed officers stepped onto the train. The atmosphere instantly changed. People stopped talking, and a heavy silence fell over the car. The officers didn't waste any time. They walked directly toward the front of the train, where the conductor had been earlier. For a moment, the woman wondered if this was a routine check, but there was something about the way the officers moved that told her it wasn't just a simple security procedure. The train conductor, who had just moments earlier forced her to the back, was standing near the front of the car, looking bewildered. He glanced up, meeting the officer's eyes, but there was no recognition or warmth in their stare. Instead, there was something colder, something more official. One of the officers spoke to him sharply, and the conductor froze, his face paling. The woman could see the confusion in his eyes as he tried to make sense of what was happening. She wasn't sure what they were saying, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. The officers weren't there to ask for a ticket or give any routine checks. They were there for him. A second officer approached the woman, pausing for a brief moment in front of her. She was about to say something when the officer spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, are you the one who was asked to move?" he asked gently. She nodded, still trying to process what was happening. "Yes, I was asked to move to the back," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. The officer didn't say anything at first, but his expression changed, softening as he looked down at her. "We've received some reports about this conductor's behavior. Just stay where you are. It's going to be all right." Before she could respond, the officer turned and walked away, heading toward the front of the train. The woman sat there completely stunned. What was going on? She had no idea what the officers had meant by reports, or why they were taking an interest in the conductor. She felt a strange mix of confusion and curiosity, but there was something in the air that made her believe this wasn't just a coincidence. Something was happening, and it didn't look good for the man who had treated her so unfairly. The officers exchanged a few words with the conductor, who now looked nervous and visibly shaken. His hands trembled as he tried to explain himself, but the officers weren't listening. The woman could hear snippets of the conversation, words like complaint, unprofessional conduct, and racial discrimination. But the full context was unclear. What she did know, however, was that the situation was quickly escalating, and it wasn't in the conductor's favor. The woman's mind raced as she watched the officers speak to the conductor. She couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, though she wasn't entirely sure what was going on. The situation had gone from tense to completely unexpected in a matter of minutes. She glanced around at the other passengers, who were now staring openly at the scene unfolding before them. The conductor was becoming more flustered, his words stumbling as he tried to explain himself to the officers. But it was clear they weren't buying it. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face, raised his voice just enough for everyone in the car to hear. "You've been reported multiple times, and this isn't the first complaint against you," he said, his tone sharp. "We've had enough of your behavior, especially towards passengers. You're done here." The conductor's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He seemed to realize, too late, that his actions were about to catch up with him. The woman felt a strange sense of satisfaction wash over her. It was as if the universe was stepping in to correct the injustice she had just experienced. The conductor, who had acted with so much arrogance only moments ago, now stood there visibly shaken, unable to defend himself. The officer continued to speak to him, but the woman couldn't make out the words anymore. All she could focus on was the feeling of justice that was slowly unfolding. The conductor wasn't going to get away with this. Another officer, a woman with short cropped hair, stepped forward and motioned for the conductor to step off the train. "We're removing you from this train. There's an investigation into your conduct and we're taking this seriously." The woman was still trying to process it all, but the words felt like a weight lifting from her chest. She had been wronged, and it seemed like the system was finally working to make it right. She could feel a sense of justice rising in her, and though she wasn't someone who liked confrontation, the relief she felt was undeniable. The conductor, clearly beaten, started to move toward the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As the officers escorted him off the train, a hushed murmur spread through the passengers. Some were whispering in disbelief, others nodding with approval, but no one said anything directly to the woman. She remained seated, her hands resting on her lap, her heart still racing. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but the scene unfolding before her was something she would never forget. The doors closed behind the officers as they stepped off the train, and the tension that had gripped the car suddenly evaporated. The train started to move again, but it felt different. The air seemed lighter, less oppressive. The woman looked out the window again, but this time she didn't feel the same heaviness. There was a sense of quiet triumph, though it wasn't over yet. She still didn't know exactly what had triggered the officers to board the train, but she could sense that something had finally been set in motion. The conductor had gotten what he deserved, and in a way, so had she. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the ride carry her forward. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been treated unfairly, ignored, or dismissed without a second thought. And today, for once, someone had stepped in to make it right. As the train continued its journey, the woman couldn't shake the sense of disbelief that lingered in her mind. What had just happened? How had everything turned so quickly, from a moment of embarrassment to a strange feeling of vindication? She had been humiliated by the conductor only moments earlier, and now, here she was, sitting quietly while the train moved on. The injustice she'd felt was still fresh in her mind, but now it seemed to have been swept aside by something bigger, something she couldn't quite explain. She'd been the target of someone's anger simply because of who she was, but now it was clear that he had been the one who would face the consequences. She sat back in her seat, her hands still resting on her lap, and thought about the strange turn of events. It wasn't just the fact that the conductor had been removed from the train. It was how quickly everything had unfolded. Just a few minutes earlier, she had felt completely powerless, her heart sinking with every step she took to the back of the car. Now she couldn't help but feel that something had shifted in her favor. But the question still lingered. How had the officers known to come? What had made them step in at that exact moment? It was then that she remembered something she hadn't noticed before. A few minutes before the conductor had told her to move, she had seen a man near the front of the train, looking at her with a sympathetic glance. He had been quietly observing the whole situation. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, too caught up in the heat of the moment. But now, as she replayed the scene in her mind, she realized that he had been watching her closely. Had he been the one who had reported the conductor? It seemed likely. As the train sped along the tracks, she couldn't help but wonder how many other people had witnessed the conductor's behavior before. How many other passengers had been treated the same way, only to stay silent, too afraid or unsure to say anything. But this time, someone had spoken up. Someone had done something about it. She felt a deep sense of gratitude toward whoever had reported the conductor. It wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had been pushed aside or silenced, their voices unheard. The woman's mind drifted back to the earlier moments when she had felt so helpless. The train ride had felt endless, the weight of the injustice crushing her with every passing second. But now, everything had changed. The conductor had been escorted off, his arrogance stripped away, and the train was moving forward with a new sense of normalcy. The woman leaned back and let out a slow breath. Maybe there was hope after all. Maybe, just maybe, there were still people willing to stand up against wrongdoings, even when it was uncomfortable or risky. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice from the seat next to hers. She hadn't noticed anyone sitting there before, but now a middle-aged woman was looking at her with a warm smile. The woman nodded toward the door, where the conductor had been removed. "I just want to say, I'm glad they took him off the train," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. He deserved it. The woman didn't know what to say at first. She simply nodded, unsure of how to respond. But something in the woman's tone, something in the way she had said it, made her feel less alone. It was as if, in that quiet moment, the unspoken bond between them had been formed. A bond that said, "You're not crazy. What happened was wrong, and we all saw it." The woman finally spoke, her voice steady. "Thank you. I didn't know what to do, but I guess it worked out." She looked around the train, the other passengers still lost in their own worlds. But something had changed. The atmosphere was different now. A shift had occurred, and she felt it, deeply. Not just in herself, but in the way the other passengers were now looking at her, at the whole situation. The woman who had spoken smiled again, this time more genuinely. "Sometimes karma just has a way of showing up. I'm glad it did today." The woman nodded in agreement, the weight on her shoulders finally starting to lift. She sat there for a few more moments, letting the quiet comfort of the train wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't just another face in the crowd. She wasn't invisible anymore. Today, she had stood up without even having to say a word, and the world had somehow righted itself. As the train pulled into her stop, the woman stood up to leave, but before she did, she glanced back at the empty seat where the conductor had once stood with such authority. She didn't know what the future held, or if she would ever encounter that conductor again. But she knew one thing for sure. Today had been a small victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been silenced or mistreated. And somehow, that made everything feel a little bit more bearable. As she stepped off the train, the woman took a deep breath. The cool evening air felt refreshing against her skin, a sharp contrast to the heat of the tension she had just left behind. She hadn't realized how tightly wound she'd been until now, standing on the platform, finally free from the uncomfortable atmosphere that had filled the train car. It felt like the weight of the day had been lifted off her shoulders, though a part of her still couldn't quite believe what had just happened. She walked slowly toward the exit, her steps steady but her mind racing with questions. Who had reported the conductor? How had they known to act so quickly? And what would happen to him now? These questions circled in her mind, unanswered, as she made her way out of the station. The night was quiet, the city's usual bustle softened by the fading light. It felt almost surreal. She had come into that train ride expecting nothing more than a simple commute home, but she had left with something far more unexpected, a sense of justice. It was a strange feeling, one she hadn't anticipated, but it lingered with her as she walked down the street, each step marking her departure from the scene that had turned her world upside down. But then, as she walked toward the bus stop, she remembered something. The officer had said there had been reports about the conductor, multiple complaints. It wasn't just her. She wasn't the first to experience his behavior. She wondered how many others had been in her position before, how many had felt that same sense of helplessness and frustration but hadn't had the courage to speak up. She realized that today, in some strange way, she had become part of something bigger. She wasn't the only one who had suffered from the conductor's treatment. She was just the one who had happened to be in the right place at the right time. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing in her bag. She pulled it out and checked the screen. It was a message from her best friend. "Hey, how was the train ride? You made it home, okay?" The woman paused for a moment, staring at the text. How could she explain what had just happened? She hadn't even processed it all herself, let alone figured out how to put it into words. She could feel the urge to tell her friend everything, about the conductor's rude behavior, the officers stepping in, and how in the end, the conductor had been escorted off the train. But she didn't want to sound too dramatic. She just wanted to get it out, to share the relief she was feeling. It was crazy. Long story short, the conductor was awful to me, but karma stepped in. He got removed from the train. I'll explain more when I get home. She hit send and slipped the phone back into her bag, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't just that the conductor had been caught. It was that something had shifted in her. She had been treated unfairly, but today, things had played out in a way she hadn't expected. She hadn't fought back in the way she thought she would, but in the end, she didn't have to. The universe had found a way to balance the scales for her, in a way that was far more powerful than anything she could have done on her own. As she waited for the bus, the night seemed quieter, more still than it had before. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. She could feel herself moving forward, letting go of the anger and frustration she had carried with her earlier. Today had been a victory, but more than that, it had been a reminder. Sometimes justice doesn't have to be fought for in the traditional sense. Sometimes, it just finds its way back to you when you least expect it. When the bus arrived, she stepped on, her mind still swirling with the events of the day. She sat down, looking out the window as the city passed by. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe things were starting to change, for the better. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever felt small, unheard, or invisible. Today the world had tilted just a little bit toward the right direction, and she had been there to see it happen. As the bus rolled through the streets, the woman continued to replay the events of the day in her head. The images of the conductor being escorted off the train, his face pale and defeated, kept coming back to her. It wasn't just the satisfaction of seeing him face consequences, it was the way everything had unfolded so quickly. It felt almost like a movie. She had never expected such a thing to happen in her daily life, let alone to her. She had always believed that the world was too big for justice to happen so swiftly. But today, she had seen it with her own eyes. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. She checked it. Another message from her best friend. "I can't believe it. Karma is real. I knew something would happen to him. You're amazing for handling it so well. You must feel like a weight's been lifted." The woman smiled at the text, feeling a rush of warmth. It felt good to know that someone understood, that someone else shared in the relief she was feeling. She quickly typed back a reply. "Honestly, I don't even know how to explain it. It was like the universe just stepped in. I didn't do anything, really, it just happened." She paused before adding, "But it feels good. I'm just glad he won't be able to treat people like that anymore." She hit send and leaned back in her seat, letting out a deep breath. The bus was now nearing her stop, and the city lights were beginning to blur together in the window. She didn't know exactly what to expect when she got home, but she was beginning to realize that today wasn't just about what happened on the train. It was about something bigger. It was about standing up for what's right, even if that means doing nothing at all and letting things play out the way they're meant to. She thought about the officer's words. "We've received some reports about this conductor." It made her wonder how many other passengers had been treated the same way, how many had silently endured the same kind of mistreatment she had. The woman was starting to realize that her experience wasn't isolated. It was part of a much larger pattern of behavior. It wasn't just about a single bad encounter on a train. It was about a system that, for too long, had allowed people like the conductor to get away with their actions without facing any real consequences. As the bus pulled to a stop, she stood up, grabbing her bag and making her way to the door. She felt a little lighter than when she had boarded, and the weight of the day seemed to have melted away. She stepped off the bus and walked toward her apartment building, the cool night air feeling even better now. For the first time in a while, she didn't feel burdened by the usual rush of thoughts and worries. There was a sense of clarity in her mind, a reminder that sometimes things have a way of working out on their own, even when you least expect it. She reached the door to her building and paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. She thought about the other passengers on the train, the ones who had stayed silent, the ones who had watched it all happen. She didn't blame them. Sometimes it's hard to know what to do in moments like that. But now she knew something that they might not have understood then, that sometimes things work themselves out. Sometimes karma shows up, and it doesn't ask for permission. It just happens. As she stepped inside, she felt a sense of quiet victory. She didn't need to explain the details of what had happened on the train to anyone. She knew it was enough that it had happened. The world, it seemed, had a way of balancing itself out, even when it felt like it was all too much to bear. And maybe, just maybe, today had been a reminder that change could come in the most unexpected of ways. The woman stepped into her apartment, closing the door softly behind her. The familiar smell of home, comforting and warm, greeted her. She hung up her coat and dropped her keys onto the small entry table, still processing the whirlwind of the past few hours. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her colleague. "Hey, I heard about what happened on the train. Are you okay? You're not hurt or anything, right?" She quickly typed a reply. "I'm fine, just shaken up. It's all good now, though." The conductor got removed from the train. It was unexpected, to say the least. She sat down on the couch and propped her feet up, letting the silence of her apartment settle over her. She wasn't sure how to feel about everything yet. Part of her was still in shock, unable to fully process the sudden turn of events. The other part of her was overwhelmed with relief. She didn't even realize how much the incident had affected her until now, when it was over. But in the back of her mind, a nagging thought remained. How many people had been in her place, silenced and dismissed by someone in authority? How many others had faced similar injustice without anyone to speak up for them? It was strange how quickly things had turned around. The woman had walked into that train expecting nothing more than a quiet ride home, but instead she had witnessed a shift, both in her own heart and in the way the world had unfolded around her. The entire situation had felt like a puzzle she wasn't sure how to solve, but now it felt like the pieces were finally falling into place. The conductor had been removed, yes, but so had the weight of her own feelings of powerlessness. That was the real victory. Her phone buzzed again, this time from her best friend. "I'm so glad you're okay. But wow, karma really works fast, huh? Maybe you should think about sharing your story. People need to hear this." The woman stared at the screen for a few seconds, considering the idea. Could she share what had happened? Would people believe her? It wasn't just about the conductor getting his due. It was about the idea that something as simple as standing up for what's right could lead to change. But she wasn't sure if she was ready to be the center of attention, even for something good. Still, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that perhaps her experience was more important than she'd initially thought. Maybe it could inspire others to take a stand, even in small moments, when injustice rears its head. She shook her head, her thoughts drifting. It wasn't about being a hero or getting recognition. It was about knowing that she had done the right thing, whether anyone else saw it or not. It was about knowing that the world could, at times, correct itself, even when it felt broken. She grabbed a glass of water and sat back down on the couch, her mind still buzzing. The city outside was quiet now, the night stretching long into the hours ahead. The world continued to spin as it always did, but in her small corner of it, there had been a moment of balance. The universe had spoken in a way she hadn't expected, and for once, the scales of justice had tipped in her favor. For the first time that day, she felt at peace. She knew that this moment, this small victory, was something she would carry with her for a long time. It wasn't about the confrontation, the humiliation, or even the conductor's downfall. It was about the quiet reminder that sometimes, Even when it feels like you're up against something too big to fight, life has a way of evening things out on its own. And with that thought, she let herself relax, closing her eyes as the day finally wound to a close. The next morning, the woman woke up to the usual hum of the city outside her window. The sun was peeking through the blinds, casting soft, golden light across her room. As she sat up in bed, the events of the previous day seemed to be slowly settling into her mind, like pieces of a puzzle she was just beginning to understand. She stretched, feeling the weight of the night's rest lifting from her shoulders. She hadn't realized how tense she'd been until now. Now, as the day began, she felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet assurance that yesterday had meant something more than just a train ride home. She moved through her morning routine, preparing her coffee and getting ready for the day ahead. The usual tasks felt almost automatic, like she was on autopilot. But deep down, something had shifted. The world felt a little less heavy, the future a little more open. She hadn't expected any of this. But now, looking back, she felt a bit of pride. She had been through something difficult, yes, but she had survived it. And more than that, something had been done about it. As she made her way to the kitchen, her phone buzzed again. Another message from her colleague. "I saw your post on social media. I had no idea it went that far. Wow, I'm proud of you for sharing your story. You never know who might need to hear it." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't posted anything on social media yet, at least not consciously. She quickly checked her phone and saw the post. Apparently, in the heat of the moment last night, she'd shared a quick status update about the train incident, briefly describing how she'd been treated by the conductor and how the situation had taken a turn when the officers stepped in. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. It was just a way to process what had happened. But now, reading the comments that had rolled in, she was stunned. It wasn't just her close friends who had responded. There were dozens of strangers sharing their own stories of mistreatment, some by train conductors, others in different situations, but all with the same theme. They had been dismissed, humiliated, or ignored. It seemed that the conductor's actions hadn't been an isolated incident at all. People had been watching, and they had been waiting for a chance to speak up. They were finally sharing their experiences, their frustrations, and their hopes that something like this wouldn't continue to happen. A wave of emotion washed over her. The comments weren't just about her. They were about all the people who had experienced similar things, and it felt like their voices didn't matter. The post had somehow sparked something. People were sharing, supporting one another, and voicing their own long-buried pain. And in a small way, her story had become the catalyst for it. She took a moment to reflect, the weight of everything she had gone through settling more deeply into her chest. She had been unsure about speaking up, unsure if anyone would believe her or care. But now, as the responses poured in, she realized how important it had been to say something. Her voice, her experience, had touched others in ways she couldn't have imagined. The woman felt a profound sense of connection to these strangers. It was as if, in that one moment of shared understanding, they had all found a little bit of peace. They had been heard. As she sat down with her coffee, she took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. The realization was clear now. Yesterday hadn't been about the confrontation or the humiliation. It hadn't even been about karma or the conductor facing consequences. It had been about something deeper. It had been about showing up for each other, standing up for what's right, and letting the truth be heard, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. She looked out the window at the bustling city, the same city she had been so frustrated with just a day ago. But now, it felt different. She was different. Maybe change wasn't always loud. Maybe it didn't always come with fanfare or grand gestures. Sometimes change came quietly, in the form of a shared story, a moment of honesty, a small victory that rippled out into the world. And in that quiet moment, she knew her day was going to be different too. She didn't have to do anything extraordinary. She just had to keep living with the same sense of purpose and clarity she felt right now. Things were shifting, not just for her, but for everyone who had been waiting for their voice to be heard. As the woman walked through her usual routine that day, she couldn't stop thinking about the unexpected ripple effect her post had caused. She had always been someone who kept her head down, who avoided conflict whenever possible. But today, something felt different. Her story, simple as it seemed, had sparked conversations, and now, it was clear that the people who had been silently suffering under the same kind of treatment were beginning to feel like they weren't alone. That realization made her heart swell with pride. But even more, it made her reflect on the importance of being heard, of standing up, and of taking small steps that could lead to something bigger. As she sat down at her desk at work, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from a stranger, someone she didn't know. "I just wanted to thank you. I've been going through something similar, but I didn't have the courage to speak up. Your story made me realize I don't have to stay quiet anymore." She stared at the message, her heart skipping a beat. This was what she had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. She quickly typed a reply, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you for reaching out. You're not alone, and it's never too late to stand up for yourself. I'm proud of you for even considering it." It was a small exchange, but it felt like something powerful. It was proof that what had happened wasn't just a one-time event. It was a spark, something that could light the way for others to take action, to not let injustice pass unnoticed. She couldn't help but think about all the moments in her life when she had been too afraid to speak out, too worried about rocking the boat. But now, she saw the power in sharing her experience, even if it was uncomfortable at first. The day passed by in a blur of emails, phone calls, and meetings. But the woman couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. People were beginning to talk, to share their experiences, and to hold those in positions of power accountable. It wasn't an easy thing to do, and it wasn't something that happened overnight. But it was happening. She felt like she was part of something much bigger than herself, a movement in its own quiet way of voices being lifted up. When she finally left work, the evening felt different too. She walked home with a sense of purpose, her footsteps lighter than they had been in days. It wasn't just about the train incident anymore. It was about the larger shift she was starting to witness. People were speaking out, their stories being heard, and the world was listening. She couldn't help but feel grateful for that, even though the journey was far from over. As she reached her apartment, she checked her phone one last time. Another message. This time from an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. "I saw your post. I'm sorry you had to go through that. It's inspiring how you handled it. I've been dealing with something at work, and reading your story made me realize I need to stand up for myself too." Her chest tightened with emotion. It seemed like everyone was waking up to the reality of standing up for what was right. She smiled, typing a quick reply. "Thank you. I think sometimes we all need a little reminder that we deserve respect. You've got this. Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are." She put the phone down and leaned against the door for a moment, letting the silence of her apartment settle in. The world outside had shifted, even if only just a little. But sometimes, small changes were the most important ones. The next step wasn't clear yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to stay silent again. Not when she knew what could happen when you finally decided to speak up. The days that followed felt like a quiet storm gathering strength. The woman continued to receive messages, some from friends and family, others from strangers who had seen her story shared online. Every time she checked her phone, there was another comment, another message of support or gratitude. It was a strange feeling, this sudden attention. But it wasn't the attention that mattered to her. It was the conversations it had sparked. She had expected to feel uncomfortable or exposed, but instead she felt a deep sense of connection. The more people reached out, the more she realized how common her experience was, and how many others were ready to speak out too. At work, things had also changed. She noticed it during meetings and casual conversations, and even in the hallway exchanges. There was a new openness, a quiet understanding among her colleagues. They were talking about things they hadn't discussed before, about standing up for themselves, about speaking up when something wasn't right. It wasn't just about what had happened to her on the train. It was about the larger, everyday injustices people faced and had kept silent about for far too long. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. This time it was an email from an anonymous account. It was a bit odd at first, but curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. "I don't know if you'll see this, but I wanted to say thank you. Your post was exactly what I needed to hear. I'm dealing with a situation at work where I've been unfairly treated, but I've been afraid to speak up. I saw how the universe worked for you, and now I'm gathering the courage to speak my truth too. You've inspired me." She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen for a long moment. The words felt heavy, but not in a burdensome way. It was like a ripple effect, one that reached far beyond her initial experience. She hadn't expected her simple act of sharing her story to have this kind of impact. She hadn't done it to be an example or to inspire others, but now, it seemed like it had become more than just her own moment of justice. It was part of a larger shift, something that was stirring in other people too. She typed a response, carefully choosing her words. "Thank you for your message. I'm glad my story resonated with you. It takes a lot of courage to speak up, and I know it's not always easy. But remember, you don't have to fight alone. I believe in you." After hitting send, she sat there for a few moments, letting the quiet wash over her. There was so much happening inside her, so many thoughts, so many emotions. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. She felt like a part of something bigger, something that had been growing in the shadows for a long time. She wasn't just telling her story anymore. She was part of a movement, one that was teaching people to reclaim their voices, to refuse silence in the face of injustice. Over the weekend, she went out with a few friends for coffee. As they sat together, chatting and catching up, the conversation turned to the events of the past week. Her friends had all seen her post, and they were eager to hear more about how everything had unfolded. One of them, a woman she had known for years, leaned in with a knowing look. "You've changed," her friend said, almost laughing. "I can't put my finger on it, but there's something different about you." The woman smiled, not quite sure how to explain what she was feeling. She thought about how her friends had always seen her as the quiet one, the one who kept her head down and avoided confrontation. But now, after everything that had happened, she felt like she was stepping into a new version of herself, a version that wasn't afraid to speak up when it mattered. "I guess you could say I've had a wake-up call," she said with a shrug. "Sometimes things need to happen for you to realize what you're capable of. It's funny, though. I didn't even realize how many people were going through the same thing until I spoke up." Her friend nodded thoughtfully. "That's the thing about injustice. It thrives in silence. But once you start speaking, others find the courage to do the same." It was a simple statement, but it hit home. Her friend was right. Injustice thrived when it went unchallenged, when people were too afraid to say something. But once someone stepped forward, others felt empowered to do the same. The woman had seen it firsthand, how one story, one act of standing up, could snowball into something larger, something far-reaching. As she sipped her coffee, she realized that this was only the beginning. Her post, her experience, had opened a door, but the conversation was just getting started. People were starting to see that they didn't have to suffer in silence, that they had a voice and they deserved to be heard. She could feel the shift in the air, the quiet stirring of change. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The world hadn't changed overnight, but it was beginning to. And she, in her own small way, had been part of that change. The following week brought with it a sense of anticipation. Every time the woman checked her phone, there were more messages, more responses, more stories. The comments on her post had continued to grow, and she found herself reading through them in quiet moments between meetings or as she sat in her apartment after work. Some of the messages were simple, people thanking her for sharing, expressing their relief at knowing they weren't alone. But others were deeper. People were opening up about their own struggles, some for the first time. They spoke about the times they had been mistreated, ignored, or made to feel small, and how they had kept quiet because they feared they wouldn't be believed, or worse, that they would be blamed. The woman couldn't help but feel both humbled and overwhelmed by the outpouring of honesty. These were not just strangers reaching out. They were people who had felt the same sting of injustice, and now they were speaking up. She thought about the many times she had kept silent, when she had let things slide because it seemed easier than confronting the discomfort. But now, as she read their words, she realized that silence had never truly been the answer. Sharing her experience had made her realize how important it was for people to hear the truth, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it wasn't easy. One afternoon, she found herself walking through the park, reflecting on the past few days. The weather had finally turned warmer, and the streets were full of people enjoying the sunshine. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she was walking with a sense of purpose, her steps more confident. She passed a group of people sitting on a bench, chatting and laughing, and one of them caught her eye. It was a woman she vaguely recognized, but she couldn't place where from. The woman smiled at her as she walked by, and then, to the woman's surprise, she stopped and turned around. "Excuse me," the woman called out. The woman stopped, slightly confused but willing to listen. "Yes?" "I saw your post online," the woman said, her voice warm but a little nervous. "About the train, I just wanted to thank you." The woman blinked, trying to make sense of the situation. "Thank me?" The woman nodded, her eyes bright. "Yeah, I've been dealing with something similar at work. Your story really hit home for me. It made me feel like maybe I could do something about it, speak up, and not just let it slide." The woman stood there for a moment, processing the unexpected encounter. It was strange, meeting someone who had read her story, but even stranger was the impact it had clearly had. The words felt almost surreal. She had been so focused on her own experience that she hadn't fully realized how far it had reached. "I'm really glad it helped," the woman finally said, her voice soft but sincere. "It's not always easy to speak up, but it's important." The woman on the bench smiled again, her eyes reflecting the same quiet strength that the woman had felt when she had decided to share her own story. "You've given me a lot of courage," she said. "Thank you." They exchanged a few more words before the woman continued on her way, her thoughts swirling in a way they hadn't before. That brief interaction, simple as it was, had made everything feel more real. It wasn't just an online post anymore. It wasn't just messages or comments. It was a living, breathing conversation that was now spreading in unexpected ways, touching people in ways that were beyond what she had imagined. As she walked on, she realized that speaking up hadn't just been about her. It had been about creating a space for others to do the same. It had been about giving people permission to claim their own voices, to stop hiding behind fear or shame, and to take ownership of their stories. She hadn't set out to start a movement, but that was exactly what was happening. Later that evening, she sat down with her phone in hand, reading through more messages. One in particular caught her eye, another stranger, but this time the message was longer, filled with details about the sender's own experience. She had been facing harassment at work, something she had kept silent about for months, fearing retaliation. But after reading the woman's post, she had decided to report it. She stared at the screen, thinking about how much it meant for someone to take that step. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about real people, real change, happening in real time. The woman set the phone down and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This wasn't just the end of her own story. This was the beginning of something bigger, and she was a part of it. That realization filled her with a quiet strength. She had no idea where this journey would take her, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid to find out. The next few weeks passed in a blur, but they were a blur filled with a quiet sense of purpose. The woman continued to read through the messages, some of them heartbreaking, others uplifting. People from all walks of life were reaching out to her, sharing their own stories of mistreatment, of moments when they had felt overlooked, silenced, or powerless. And with each message, something inside her grew, a sense of responsibility, yes, but also a deep understanding of just how much work still needed to be done. She found herself reflecting often on the idea of silence, the kind of silence that allows injustice to grow unnoticed, the kind of silence that makes people feel like their voices don't matter. For so long, she had lived in that silence, assuming that her one voice wasn't strong enough to make a difference. But now, in the wake of everything that had happened, she saw just how powerful one voice could be, and how much more could be done when that voice wasn't alone. One day she received a message from a woman who had recently taken a similar step to the one she had. The woman had been facing ongoing mistreatment at work and had stayed quiet for months, afraid that speaking up would only make things worse. But after seeing how her story had impacted others, she had decided to report her own situation to HR. She'd sent an email explaining the issues she'd been facing, detailing the moments where she had been unfairly treated, and asking for support. She was scared, yes, but she had done it. And when she shared the email with the woman, it felt like a triumph, both for the woman who had sent it and for the woman who had inspired her. The woman sat in her apartment that evening, rereading the message over and over. The act of speaking out wasn't always easy, and it didn't always lead to immediate results. But it had made a difference. It had given this woman the courage to take control of her own story and demand what she deserved: respect. The woman thought back to that moment on the train, the embarrassment, the frustration, the humiliation. She thought about how she had sat at the back of the car, feeling powerless, wondering if anything would ever change. And now, here she was, not only finding her voice but helping others find theirs too. The quiet ripple of one decision, one shared experience, had turned into something larger than she could have imagined. As she moved through her daily life, she began to see small signs of change, both in herself and in others. At work, her colleagues were more open about their own struggles, whether it was with a boss who didn't listen or a system that didn't seem fair. They were talking, discussing, debating, but most importantly, they were listening. The conversations had shifted, and the woman found herself having discussions that just a few weeks ago would have seemed impossible. People were talking about what it meant to stand up for themselves, to speak out against unfair treatment, and to support each other when things got tough. But while she was encouraged by these changes, the woman knew that this was just the beginning. There were still so many people who hadn't found their voice yet, so many moments when silence still ruled the day. Her journey had made her realize that true change wasn't just about one person speaking up. It was about creating a space where others felt comfortable doing the same. One afternoon, after work, the woman met up with a close friend at a local cafe. They hadn't had a chance to catch up in a while, and the conversation flowed easily as they sat down with coffee in hand. But eventually, the topic turned back to the train incident, the thing that had started it all. "I've been thinking about it," her friend said, stirring her drink thoughtfully. "What you did, it's not just about that one situation. It's about how you made people realize they don't have to stay quiet." The woman nodded, feeling a surge of emotion. "I never thought it would have this much impact. But now, when I see how many people are sharing their stories, it feels like maybe we're all waking up. Like we've been silent for so long, and now we're not afraid to say something anymore." Her friend smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "Exactly. And it's not about being perfect or always doing the right thing. It's about showing up and saying, 'This isn't okay,' and encouraging others to do the same. You've started something big, whether you realize it or not." For a moment, the woman let those words settle in. It wasn't about expecting grand results right away. It was about small steps, about showing people that their voices mattered. And that was something that could take root and grow in unexpected ways. As they continued talking, the woman realized that she had come a long way since that train ride. She had gone from feeling isolated and alone to feeling like she was part of a larger movement, one that was slowly but steadily gaining strength. And while there was still work to do, she knew now that change was possible, even if it came in quiet, incremental moments. And for the first time in a long while, the woman felt truly hopeful. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had found the courage to speak up, to demand respect, and to be heard. They weren't alone anymore, and together they could create a world where silence wasn't the norm, but the exception. As the weeks rolled by, the woman found herself reflecting more and more on what had transpired since that moment on the train. What had started as an uncomfortable and humiliating experience had transformed into something far larger than she could have anticipated. She never imagined that speaking up about what had happened, sharing her story about the train conductor, would lead to this wave of conversation, of people reaching out and finding the courage to speak their own truths. But now it seemed like the ripple effects were growing, expanding beyond her small circle, reaching into workplaces, schools, and communities. It wasn't just online messages anymore. People were approaching her in person, some with stories of their own, others simply expressing gratitude. She could see the change, even in the most casual moments. The way people interacted with each other at work had shifted, conversations had become more open, and there was a sense of shared understanding in the air. She wasn't the only one who had been treated unfairly. Everyone had a story. It had taken one person, one incident, to spark the conversation, but now it was a growing movement of voices, each one finding its moment to speak. One evening, after work, the woman met a few colleagues for drinks at a local bar. The group was a mix of people from different departments, most of them acquaintances, a couple she had become closer with over the years. As they gathered around the table, the conversation naturally turned to the topic of work and the challenges everyone faced on a daily basis. It was the kind of conversation that often stayed within the boundaries of polite small talk, but tonight felt different. "I've been meaning to tell you," one of her colleagues, a woman in her late 30s, said as she stirred her drink. "You really made me think differently about speaking up. After your post, I went back to HR. I finally reported the issues I'd been having with my manager. I was so scared to do it. But now, after seeing how it worked out for you, I realized I had to." The woman's heart swelled as she heard the words. This wasn't the first time someone had shared something similar with her, but hearing it out loud, especially from someone she worked closely with, felt powerful. It was one thing to read a message or hear about it secondhand, but to know that her decision to speak up had given someone the courage to do the same, that was something she had never expected. "I'm so proud of you," the woman replied, her voice steady but full of emotion. "It's not easy, but sometimes it's the hardest things that lead to the best changes. I'm glad it helped." As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, the woman's mind lingered on her colleague's words. She had heard so many similar stories now. Stories of people stepping up in their workplaces, families, and communities. It wasn't just about individual victories anymore. It was about collective change. People were starting to realize that their voices had power, that the discomfort of speaking up wasn't as overwhelming as the weight of staying silent. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about a single instance of injustice. It was about the broader, more systemic issues that people faced every day. And while one act of speaking out might not change everything, it was a step toward something bigger. It was a way of showing that the status quo didn't have to be accepted, that there were consequences when people were treated unfairly, and that silence didn't have to be the default response. In the months that followed, the woman continued to share her experience when it felt appropriate. She spoke at local events, mostly informal gatherings with friends, co-workers, or even acquaintances who had reached out after hearing her story. Each time she shared, she found new layers to the conversation. It wasn't just about race or gender or class, though those were certainly part of the conversation. It was about power, authority, and the way people were conditioned to accept unfair treatment. She learned, too, that some people hadn't even realized they had been mistreated until they saw others speaking up. Sometimes, it wasn't until someone else called out the injustice that they could see it in their own lives. This realization struck her with a surprising intensity. It wasn't just that people were standing up against the same kind of treatment she had faced. It was that they were waking up to the subtle ways they had been conditioned to accept less than they deserved. People were beginning to question the systems they had been a part of, whether it was the workplace, family dynamics, or even social structures. One particular night, she sat with a group of women she had met through a local community group. They were all from different walks of life, but they had come together because they had a shared desire to support one another in the face of adversity. After a long conversation about the challenges each of them faced, both in the workplace and in their personal lives, the woman found herself speaking again, this time with more conviction. I think the hardest part of speaking up is realizing how long we've been silent, how much we've accepted. We're taught to keep our heads down, to just keep going, to avoid rocking the boat. But what happens when we don't rock the boat? She said, her voice louder now, as if she were speaking to herself just as much as to the group. It just keeps sailing in the wrong direction and we all get caught up in it. There was a moment of quiet in the room as everyone took in her words. Then, one by one, the others began to share their own experiences of times when they had stayed silent, when they had kept their frustrations to themselves because they didn't think speaking up would make a difference. But now, in this space, it felt different. It felt like change was possible. That night, the woman left the gathering feeling a sense of connection she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the community she was a part of, and the collective strength they could find when they shared their voices. She thought about the many quiet moments when she had kept her head down, when she had felt small or powerless. But now she could see it clearly. Those moments were the very ones that needed to be spoken about. Those were the moments that, once shared, had the power to change everything. As she walked home, she realized that she was no longer just a bystander to her own story. She had become an active participant in shaping the world around her. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear: the silence was finally starting to break, piece by piece. It had been months since that fateful train ride, and the woman found herself standing at a crossroads in her life. The events that had unfolded in the weeks following her decision to share her experience had led her down a path she hadn't anticipated. What had started as a moment of personal frustration and humiliation had grown into something larger, an unexpected movement that had touched the lives of many others. It was no longer just about her story or that single unfair moment on a train. It was about how speaking out, even in the smallest ways, could create a ripple effect that spread far beyond the initial act. She had spent countless hours thinking about what had happened, reflecting on the powerful realization that silence had been her prison for so long. She had been conditioned to accept things as they were, to keep quiet, to avoid rocking the boat. She had never realized how much she had internalized those lessons until she finally spoke out. It was as if a dam had broken, and once that initial crack had appeared, there was no turning back. She had heard countless stories since then, stories of people in her life, in her community, and even from complete strangers, who had faced similar injustices, people who had been treated unfairly, ignored or humiliated, but had stayed silent because they didn't believe they could change anything. But now, after witnessing the power of her own story, they were finding the courage to speak up, and in doing so, they were finding each other. What struck her the most, though, was the realization that the change wasn't just happening in the big moments. It wasn't just about the public acknowledgement of injustice or the applause of recognition. It was in the small, everyday acts of standing up for oneself and others. It was in the quiet moments when someone finally decided that they deserved better and chose to act on it. And that was where the real power lay. As she sat in her favorite coffee shop one afternoon, the woman couldn't help but smile as she overheard a conversation at the next table. A young woman was telling her friend about an interaction she had had at work that day. Her manager had been condescending, dismissive, and disrespectful during a meeting, and for the first time, the young woman had found the courage to speak up. She had addressed the behavior directly, and although her voice had trembled at first, she had stood firm. The manager had been taken aback, but in the end, she had earned his respect, and most importantly, her own. The woman listened, her heart swelling with pride. It wasn't that the young woman had brought the manager to his knees. It was that she had found her voice, had recognized that she deserved to be treated with respect. That small act of courage was part of the larger, shifting tide that was taking place. People were beginning to see that silence wasn't the answer, that they didn't have to suffer in silence, and they didn't have to accept mistreatment. They had the power to demand better. Later that evening, as she sat at home scrolling through her phone, a message popped up from an old acquaintance. It was someone she hadn't spoken to in years, a former co-worker from a job long past. The message was simple, but meaningful. "I don't know if you remember me, but I saw your post a few months ago about what happened on the train. I just wanted to tell you that it made a huge impact on me. I've been dealing with something similar for a while, but after reading your story, I found the courage to speak up at work, and I'm glad I did. I'm finally being heard." The woman sat there, staring at the message for a moment. She didn't know this person very well, but the words hit her deeply. She realized that her story, which had seemed so personal and isolated, had now become part of a much larger tapestry, a story of empowerment that was being passed from one person to another, one voice at a time. It wasn't just her voice anymore. It was the collective voice of anyone who had ever felt overlooked or silenced, and that voice was growing louder. The next day, she attended a community meeting. It was a gathering of people who had started coming together to share their stories, to talk about how they could support one another in the fight against injustice, whether it was at work, in their families, or in society. As she sat in the circle, listening to each person speak, she realized just how far this conversation had come. The room was filled with people who had once felt alone, isolated in their experiences, but now they were united by a shared sense of purpose. They were standing together, ready to take on the systems that had allowed them to be treated as less than they were. One woman, a teacher, spoke about how she had always been afraid to stand up to her administration when she saw unfair practices. But after hearing the woman's story and the stories of others in the room, she had begun to make changes in her own school, pushing for policies that would support both teachers and students equally. Another person, a man in his 50s, talked about how he had been afraid to challenge his boss's sexist comments in meetings. But after hearing other people's stories, he had finally found the courage to speak up and had seen a positive change in the way his workplace interacted. As the meeting drew to a close, the woman looked around the room, her heart full. The conversations, the stories, the shared experiences, they were all part of something larger now. She had never set out to be a leader or a voice for others, but now she realized that's exactly what she had become. Not because she was special, but because she had done something so simple. She had spoken up, and in doing so, she had helped others find the strength to do the same. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about being brave every single moment. It was about showing up, about sharing your truth, and trusting that it would matter. And it was in the act of showing up that the world slowly, imperceptibly began to change. When she left the meeting, the woman stepped out into the cool evening air. The city lights twinkled around her, but it wasn't the lights that caught her attention. It was the quiet, powerful hum of change that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface. It wasn't something loud or grand, but something real, something that had the potential to shift everything. She walked down the street, her steps sure and steady, no longer burdened by the weight of silence, but buoyed by the knowledge that she was part of something bigger now, a movement of voices that had begun to rise together. And as she walked, she realized one thing: change, real change, wasn't about fighting the world alone. It was about lifting each other up, giving each other the courage to speak, and knowing that in the end, we were all stronger when we stood together. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.